So you have this phenomena going on, which you can't analyze it the same way you can analyze a financial cycle because it's largely psychological, it's group think, it's collective impulses and so on. But you end up with a situation where empires inevitably go bad. And since they inevitably go bad, then you look to try to find out how they're going bad, why they're going bad, when they're going bad. And that's what you do. And you still don't really know, but you can kind of see the patterns repeating themselves. And right now, the U.S. seems to be on the decline. Seems to me like it's been on the decline since about 1999. And all these pieces start fitting together. 1999 was when we had the tech sell-off, end of the dot-coms and so on. And if you look at almost any statistic, any rating of countries around the world, you see that since 1999, the U.S. has gone down relative to other countries.
To the Wiggin Sessions. I'm Addison Wiggin. I have with me my erstwhile writing partner, Bill Bonner, founder of the Agora Companies. Bill is the author of a new book coming out by Wiley this fall, titled To Be Determined. Currently, it's called Win, Win, or Lose, A Modest Theory of Civilization. I've worked with Bill for many years. Right now, he's at I.O.U.S.A in what they call La France Profonde in about 4 hours south of Paris, at a country manor he purchased when we were living in Paris and working on the Daily Reckoning back in the day. Longtime readers will recognize that we worked together for many years and published a few books together. Bill, welcome. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and get your unique perspective on markets and the economy. Welcome, Bill.
Well, thank you. Just a warning to readers, I'm out in the countryside of France and the bandwidth is not so hot. So I freeze up from time to time.
I'm sure we can deal with it. Bill, I wanted to start with a little bit of anecdote from my own personal history at I.O.U.S.A. There was one time I was there, it was in the early days of the Daily Reckoning, and I was down at the farmhouse, which is maybe quarter of a mile away down the country lane from where you are right now in the Octagon. And I was trying to catch up on Dr. Richard Baser's theories. We were publishers of his newsletter, I should say the late Dr. Richard Baser. And there was a couple of concepts that he was talking about that I really didn't understand. First of all, he wrote English in a Germanic construct, so his sentences were very long, and it was difficult to understand his language first off. But then he was talking about very sort of complicated economic ideas. I walked up the road and you were rebuilding a stone wall that was holding up the lawn. And you're like, hey, Addison, I'm building this wall in the same fashion that the Romans did 2,000 years ago. You're out there, you're all muddy and rebuilding. And that's my experience with I.O.U.S.A is that you bought it and you and the family had been fixing it up for a number of years before I was there. And then you continue to maintain the place by hand. I just always thought that was fascinating. Can you tell me a little bit about I.O.U.S.A? I know there's a Roman road that goes by the property on the backside, but maybe a little bit, just so readers are aware of where you are right now.
It's between Poitiers and Limoges, and it's the middle of nowhere. So, people don't come here unless they have a reason to come here. And the old families do have a reason because they hold on to their properties. So they're here in the summertime. So in the summertime, there's quite a lively community here, and the rest of the year is pretty much dead. It's very pleasant, partly because it's out of the way. There aren't any tourists of any sort around. It's very calm and very quiet. And, we've been here now for 26 years, and it's always been a pleasure. And the house, which, we bought because it was big, old, and it needed to be fixed up. And I like fixing up houses. So, and I didn't know how to do it because it's a different kind of European construction. It's different from American construction. But anyway, we bought the house and it had lots of bedrooms, which was handy because we have lots of children. We have 6 children, and the children came with their aunt and their mother. And, I shouldn't say mother, they came with their grandmother. And we had a whole little community here. And then it got to be very quiet because the children grew up and left. And so it was just Elizabeth and me in the house, and we were rambling around this big house, big drafty, cold house. But this summer, the children came back. So we had the children and they brought their children. So it's a whole new thing. We had lots of small children running around, and it was great fun. It reminded me of the time when you were here along with John Ford and the rest of the crowd. We had a lot of people and it was very lively.
Those were great times. And I had kids then too. So they were running around. I remember Merritt, who actually now works with us here on the Wiggin sessions. He's 22 now, but he and Henry were down by, there's a big, I think it's an apple tree down in the back of the back 40 there. Mm-hmm. And Henry got bucked by a horse, and Merritt was standing by just shocked. He'd never seen anything like that. Anyway, so that place gives you a good location to think deeply about things. You're publishing a book now, which you've titled Win, Win or Lose, A Modest Theory of Civilization. And I can just imagine you sitting there trying to rebuild a retaining wall in the Roman style, thinking deeply about how civilization works better when people cooperate than the way we currently function, which is sort of top down and a lot of monkeying with the financial system and regulations of the economy itself. Can you talk a little bit about your ideas in that book? It's going to be coming out later in the fall, but you can tell me what you were thinking.
Well, the idea is really very simple, and that is that cooperation, win-win deals, is what allowed civilization to go forward. And I think the kind of the critical date in history was like 2,000 years ago, when Jesus Christ, of all people, he said, if you want to get ahead in life, you have to do unto others the way you'd have them do unto you. It's very simple. And you see that there are a lot of pieces to civilization, but that is probably the critical one, that when you see somebody, you can't kill them. You can't steal their stuff. You have to work with them. You have to work out a deal. And since you have to do that, that means you have to create something. And there are other things that go along with civilization. That rule is probably the cornerstone, but you need property rights. If you don't have property rights, then you can't really build, because you can't protect what you've got. And you need money. You need money to be able to exchange your product with other people. So you need a language. You need a written language, although I'm not quite sure about that. But I think you need a written language too. Otherwise, you can't make any progress. So all these things sort of came together over thousands of years, and these things are different from what a lot of people think of as civilization. A lot of people think the government can pass a law and make us richer or make us more civilized or whatever. But it ain't so. It doesn't work that way. Civilization arises from the bottom. It doesn't come down from the top. And from the bottom, people make deals with each other, which are essentially win-win. They say, I'll cut your lawn if you'll give me a gallon of milk. I'll build something. And then once you're in that deal-making mentality, then you're thinking about how to cut people's lawn faster. Next thing you know, you're inventing lawnmowers and everything. So I think all of civilization comes down to being able to do those kind of deals. That's why I called it win-win or lose, because the opposite is the losing is what happens all the time when the government gets into the picture and they start a war or something, then everybody loses. Civilization goes backward.
When you talk about this, I know you've written about it in Bonner Private Research. When you're talking about it, what is the kind of reaction that you get? I'm just curious, because I know working with you in the Daily Reckoning, you postulate, I think you had the unified theory of greed once.
Well,
it often confuses people, but it's a simple idea. And if we followed it, the unified theory of greed or the modest theory of civilization, if we followed them, life would be better for everyone, in my view. And also, I have said this to you before, that I think this is your best work, your best book that you've written.
Well, I think it is too, because it brings together a lot of things that I've been thinking about for a long time. And it's nothing new, by the way. There's nothing new in that book that you can't find in Adam Smith or or the free market economist or uh, or Milton Friedman, a lot of people who write about the same sort of thing, and everybody comes at it from a different angle. What I tried to do was to come at it from an angle that made sense to me, and this does, and I think so far it's been missed. The people, in fact, our current civilization, our current status of society is going the other direction, with more and more people who think that they can get something by using political means, which are essentially the opposite of win-win. A political move, anything political is win-lose by definition. You do an election, somebody loses. You pass a law, this latest law that they've passed, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. It's some people win from that, mostly people who make solar panels and electric cars and things like that. But most people lose. That's the way all legislation works, practically all legislation. Let's not get into too deep into this, but almost all legislation is taking from one group, taxpayers, and giving to another group. Could be a subsidy to farmers, could be a subsidy to somebody else, could be a tariff protection for what they do, could be, just a hiring people. But one way or another, money changes hands, and it's not win-win, it's win-lose. You take the money from somebody, you give it to somebody else. Somebody loses, somebody wins, and everybody gets poorer from that sort of transaction.
Just to move on from that, what kind of solutions do you approach in the book itself? I'm just curious because I think readers will want to know how to think about, even if they agree with you, win-win or lose, if you're stuck in this kind of political environment that, especially since Trump came on the scene. I've written this before, that the worst thing that Trump did is make people interested in politics again. But what do you do in the face of an environment where politics kind of rules the day and controls the economy?
What do you do? What can you do? You're not going to change the system, or you're not going to change anybody's mind about it. I mean, maybe at the margin you will. But what really, you're the situation where, imagine that you're a factory owner in Russia in 1917. What can you do? Well, all you can do is try to sell that thing and get over to America and start your factory there. And a lot of people did. Imagine that you're a Jew in Germany in 1935. What are you going to do? Are you going to say, okay, well, this guy's not so bad. He'll learn and things will be okay. What can you do? You say, well, oh, you got to get out to vote, or you've got to do something like that. No, that won't work. There are times to be somewhere else. And that's true for investors, of course. There are times to be in the market and time to be out of it. And generally, as Warren Buffett tells us, the time to be out of a market is when it's very, very expensive. The time to be in a market is when it's cheap. When is it cheap? It's cheap when people don't want to be in it. So it's all sort of contrarian, but there's no secret. In my book that's coming out, I'm not revealing any secrets about how to do anything or how to make any money or anything. I'm just trying to understand how things work. And then when you do understand how things work, I think you're much better prepared to deal with it one way or another. We've been, in my little group, the Bonner Private Research, we include, as part of what we work on, we include investment advice, but we also include advice about where to live, because we think that when things get rough, it matters where you live. You don't want to be in St. Petersburg in 1917. You don't want to be in Germany in 1935. There are places you just don't want to be. And Baltimore, I think, is one of those places. It's a rough city in any time, but when things get really rough, it's going to be rougher. So we did these things, this report we called the Bolt Hole Report. Dan Denning, whom you know, and Tom Dyson worked on it together. And they went around the country looking for communities, small towns usually, where they felt safe, where they felt comfortable, where they like being. And that's kind of that's kind of a part of an answer to, what you can do. Well, you can't change anything. You just have to go with it. But the most important thing is to understand it, to recognize what's going on. And that's really what I've tried to do in this book.
One of the things that you write about is what you see as a crack up boom coming. And I remember we were writing about that in the Daily Reckoning. just prior to the 2008 financial crisis. What is similar today to what we saw in like the lead up to 2008? And I'll preface that with, I just published this week a chart that overlays the S&P 500 over from the current 2-year period, 2000 to 2020 to 2022, overlaid with the lead up from 2006 to 2008 prior to the financial crisis. And the chart is eerily similar. And I remember doing the same thing back when we were looking at the charts of like the NASDAQ back in the tech wreck. It looked eerily similar to prior crack ups.
Yeah.
What do you've been writing a lot about that in BPR, and I'm just
these things, these things look very similar. We've been through several of them now, because we went through the tech wreck, as you say, in 1999, 2000, 2001. Then we had the mortgage crisis in 2007, 2009. Then we had the COVID panic. But these things look very similar. Right now, however, we're kind of at a funny point where we've already passed the peak. We've already had some sell-offs. People are wondering what's going on. Remember, inflation came along, got up to 4-decade highs, and people all of a sudden started freaking out, like the Fed itself, realizing that it was way, way behind the curve. They were lending money out at 0 interest rates when inflation was running at 9%. Now they're up to 2.5, but inflation is still 8.5. There's a big gap. In order to defeat inflation, you've got to get ahead of it. You can't stay behind it. So we have this confusing situation right now. It's very confusing because the Fed is talking about getting tough on inflation, but it's not yet tough, not at all. And people are anticipating higher interest rates. So we see mortgage rates now are up. The 10-year bond, the U.S. 10-year Treasury bond, is at 3% yield, which is much higher than it was just 2 years ago. So we have all these things happening which are contradictory, partly just confusing. But what I make of it is that we're in this transition period where we've seen the peaks. We've seen the peaks in bonds. We've seen the peaks in stocks, but we haven't seen the bottom. So we're just in that downward confusion, which everybody misinterprets. Nobody really knows, and I actually don't know either. But if it's true that we've seen the peaks, then what we're waiting for is the bottoms. And in the meantime, people kind of think the bottoms are coming along every day, and they can buy the dip, and stocks will go back up. And they say that we've seen the worst of inflation, which seems to be very unlikely. And since we've seen the worst of inflation, they think the Fed can now pivot, they use that word, pivot, to its familiar stance of creating inflation.
I just want to ask this question directly. One of the critiques of the current inflationary environment is that the Fed is powerless to do anything about it. They were behind the 8 ball, and that's a standard sort of ad hoc attack on their policy and their model. But there's also the argument that the supply side disruptions in supply chains and difficulties with the war in Ukraine and Russia on the energy front contribute more to inflation than simply Fed policy. And if that's true, then the Fed raising rates can have the effect of dampening demand, but it can't do anything about boats floating off the coast of Long Beach and truck, a lack of truckers to get goods across the country and stuff. So there's actually a supply side inflation that the Fed can't do anything about.
Well, that's certainly true. But the trouble is, the only thing the Fed can do anything about is the demand side. That's what it's been doing. And the Fed printed, we say printed because it's the way in which they increase the available cash and credit, $8 trillion since 1999. That's a lot of money. And that's got to go somewhere. And by the way, central banks worldwide increased their own balance sheets by 9 times, an 800% increase since 2020. That's huge. And that's since 2009. I got mixed up there, but that's huge. That money has to go somewhere. So you can look at all the supply side disruptions that you want, and the war in the Ukraine, and all the people, all these young people who are quitting their jobs, and all these sorts of things. And sure, some of them play a role. We don't know how much, but what we do know is the Fed is printing money. And since that's the only thing we can control, it seems to me to be very short-sighted to try to ignore it, because some other things might have an effect as well.
You make the statement that the situation that we're in now is different than other times. Most people say this time is different because they have a positive view on the government's ability to manage their way through it. This time is different. We'll figure it out. But you have written and have made the statement that that this is the situation we're in now is bigger than macroeconomics. It's bigger than history. What do you mean by that? What part of the cycle are we in? How do you describe what you mean by that?
Well, I hardly know how to describe it, but what I think happens is that history has a mind of its own, and it follows these deep patterns. People, they're not totally unpredictable, and they're not totally irrational or anything, but they are not anything anybody can control. I mean, for example, there's the empire, what you could call the empire cycle. A country gets really big, it gets really powerful, it gets really rich, and then what does it do? And just not just the United States, by the way, but all empire, it throws its weight around. It starts getting involved in other people's business. It starts wars in other countries. And before you know it, it's got all kinds of wars going on. And these things are very expensive. And meanwhile, at home, these wars and the manipulation of the economy causes a recession, or it slows the rate of growth, which is exactly what we've seen in the U.S. People are less interested in going into manufacturing and more interested in going into finance and politics and all the sexy things that people do. And so what you have is an economy that doesn't work as well. Where are the engineers? Where are the people who know how to build bridges? Where are the people who know how to do stuff like that? Those people that, Byron, our friend Byron, talks about the lack of petroleum engineers. They've practically disappeared because nobody wants to be in college and tell his friends that he's studying how to drill holes to bring out oil. The people who are essential to our economy, they kind of disappear because it's not very fashionable in a late stage empire. So you have this phenomena going on, which you can't analyze it the same way you can analyze a financial cycle, because it's largely psychological, it's groupthink, it's collective impulses and so on. But you end up with a situation where empires inevitably go bad. And since they inevitably go bad, then you look to try to find out how they're going bad, why they're going bad, when they're going bad. And that's what you do. And you still don't really know, but you can kind of see the patterns repeating themselves. And right now, the U.S. seems to be on the decline. Seems to me like it's been on the decline since about 1999, and all these pieces start fitting together. 1999 was when we had the tech sell-off, end of the dot-coms and so on. And if you look at almost any statistic, any rating of countries around the world, you see that since 1999, the U.S. has gone down relative to other countries. So anyhow, that's what I mean. There's something bigger going on, something that we don't control. I mean, theoretically, we could control it, but we can't really, because what happens is an empire becomes powerful, and the power corrupts the people who run the empire, the elite, because an elite always gets control of a government. That's another important point that I don't think many people realize, that we have a democratic government. It means that we elect our representatives, and that we think that we, the people, control the government. That's the whole idea. But it doesn't work that way at all. There's a small group of people, an elite, the people who write newspaper columns, the people who run for Congress, the lobbyists, the lawyers, and the people who run the government. Those people actually do run the government, and they actually decide what the government will do. And since those people have very different interests from the people at large, we end up with a corrupt government doing things that does not help the people. And it's very similar to the last days of Rome, or the last days of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the English Empire for that matter. So that's what I mean by things having a pattern of their own, sort of apart from anything that we can can analyze or understand or do anything about.
I want to read an excerpt from something that you wrote recently, and I have to read it because it's a little bit long. But you were talking about Louis XIV, Louis XIV of France, and you had written a typical meal for Louis XIV consisted of a whopping 20 or 30 dishes. The first course was, of course, hors d'oeuvres such as pheasant, shellfish soup or pate. Fruit was served in the shape of a large pyramid. Other dishes included roasted beef and pies and chicken, turkey, duck, boar, venison, and beef. That was a typical meal. But then, then you go on to say, what is wrong with Donald Trump eating McDonald's in the White House? That's one thing I like about working with you and writing with you, is that you always find an interesting way to put things into perspective. But what did you what were you thinking about Donald Trump eating McDonald's in the White House?
Yeah, well, Louis XIV was he got to be very, very fat. He was kind of grotesquely fat at the end. But anyway, what the point of that was, that empires, countries, or even societies develop elites. They develop people who live at a standard that other people don't live at all. And I tried to compare the French elite under Louis XIV to the nomenclatura, that is to say, the elite of the Soviet Empire. The Russia, the Soviet Empire was set up to be an egalitarian society. It wasn't supposed to have an elite. But sure enough, after a few years, the elite were riding high on the hog. Nobody else had cars, but they had cars. They had cars with chauffeurs. They had nice houses. They crowded everybody else into apartments. We know Alex, I can't remember his last name, but our friend Alex lived that way. He came from Russia, and as a child, he lived in those apartments where they crowded 4 or 5 families together with one bathroom and one kitchen. But the elite didn't live that way. They lived well. And in fact, there was a guy who did a study of it, and he found that the elite in the people's paradise of the Soviet Union actually lived much better compared to the average person than a rich person in America. Because the rich person in America mostly ate more or less what everybody else ate, drove in a car. It wasn't so much different from everybody else's car. But in the Soviet Union, the difference was much, much greater. But there's always an elite. And that elite controls things. And that elite has very different interests. They have an interest in controlling the society in order to what? To take from it. They're essentially parasitic. They take from the productive society for themselves. And that's a hard thing for Americans to understand, because it seems to run so counter to everything we've been taught about the way our government works. So that is the way it works, unfortunately.
What is the American version of nomenclatura?
Well, nomenclatura are the government apparatchiks. That's another Russian word, but I don't know what it would be. Well, the elite, the deciders. I think that might be it. The deciders. George W. Bush came up with the deciders, and sure enough, there are all these people who decide. Most people don't decide anything in government. You vote for somebody, then you have no idea what happens. You have no control. You don't even know what they believe, really. You kind of like the way they talk on TV or something. But the deciders, somebody decides where all that money goes. This like $431 billion just been voted to make America greener. Somebody gets that money. That money doesn't go directly to a tree. It doesn't go directly to a solar panel. It goes to a company, and a company is owned by people. And those people are the deciders. They're not the ordinary people at all.
And there was 8 trillion of those dollars handed out in the last 10 years, 12 years. So what do you like? We're talking about a crack up. We're talking about the decline of the empire. We called it the empire of debt in our book that we wrote together. And it is laden with debt. When we published the second edition of Empire of Debt, we were concerned that the debt was going to go over $10 trillion. And it's just laughable now. You just laughed. I mean, it's ridiculous, especially after what happened during the pandemic and beyond. And it doesn't matter who's in office, because people were looking at Donald Trump's going to save the economy. He's going to put everyone back to work. And for a while, the economy was humming along, but he was also increasing the debt at an exponential rate. What's the end game for? I mean, we also, in another book, in Financial Reckoning Day, you and I analyzed the debt burden in Japan as their population was getting older, and they haven't gotten out of it since 1990. They had their financial crisis in the early 1990s, and they're still even more indebted by percentage than the U.S. is. Like, how long can this go on? We've been asking that question of ourselves over and over.
Yeah, and nobody knows the answer. Certainly not. I don't. But we were ahead of our time with those books. Financial Reckoning Day and the Empire of Debt, especially. That was right on target. So how long can it go on? Well, we don't know, but I think it may have already peaked. I think it might have peaked. Stocks hit a high at the end of 2021, and bonds hit a high in the summer of 2020. Those are big, big deals. It could be that they'll go higher, but it's hard now with inflation. It's hard for them to go higher in real terms. They can go high in nominal terms. So it looks to me as though with inflation now where it is, it's very hard for the Fed to reverse course, to begin printing money, or even to allow people to think that it might be printing money without actually people losing confidence in the system, the dollar, and prices generally going up a lot. So I think maybe in real terms that the peak has already been seen. And that's no guarantee about what happens in nominal terms, because prices can still go way up. Remember, in Zimbabwe in 2006, we were looking at it, and Zimbabwe had the best performing stock market in the world. But it was only because they were printing so much money and everybody wanted to get rid of the money, so they bought Zimbabwe stocks. And they went up a lot, but they didn't go up in real terms. They just went up in nominal terms. So I would expect to see a lot of that kind of stuff happening if I'm right. The real peak has already been passed, and we're now on the downward slope. Where that leads and how it leads, I don't know, but it's going to be dangerous and exciting. We want to keep our eyes open.
It's funny to me that when you talk about these things, you always have kind of a wry smile and a chuckle to go along with it. You're entertained by history.
Well,
because it doesn't go away. I remember writing about Francis Fukuyama, who had said the end of history when the Soviet Union collapsed. We were writing about that.
Yeah, we got to laugh out of that.
Like, end of history? How about a pandemic?
Yeah. How about a war on terror?
Yeah. So just in regular terms, you're entertained by it. You've taken precautions with your own money and your own lifestyle. The property you bought in France, in Ireland, in Argentina, you're prepared for your own preservation, your bolt hole. You strike me and have always struck me as a eternally optimistic person, which I remember when we were doing press conferences and whatever, being on media and stuff for Empire of Debt, that I kept trying to convince people that it was a comedy. And nobody really understood that, but I think that you grasped it pretty well. And you strike me as somebody who's very optimistic about the future, even if we have all these kind of goofy political things going on with the economy and this weird culture war that we're going through politically. Are you optimistic about the future?
I'm not really. It's either a comedy or a tragedy, and I'd rather look at it as a comedy. And it certainly is funny. The things people say, the things they do, they're outrageously, ridiculously, preposterously funny. But what do I think is going to happen? Well, I think it's going to get rough, because I think we've had very good years. I look at my own life. I was charmed. I was born in 1948, and then along came penicillin, saved my life. Then along came, back in the 60s was a wonderful time to grow up. And then I was in college in the late 60s and the 70s. I could pay my way through school by working in restaurants and things, and I did, and it was just fine. People can't do that now. I could start a business. I started a business with almost no money. Can you do that now? I don't know. It seems a lot harder to me. And by the way, look at those years. Look at the growth rate. In the 1960s, the growth rate was 5%. I could get a job anywhere. I mean, just walk across the street and ask somebody, hey, you want to? And it was so much simpler. It was so much easier. There's so much less paperwork. Well, recently, I realized that so much of what has messed up the U.S. economy is regulation. They've been passing these regulations, and there's a center, I think it might be George Washington University, where they keep track of these things. And how many in 1980, I think it was under the first year of Reagan, there were 20 regulations passed, each one with $1 billion impact or $100 billion impact. That's the way they looked at it. And under Biden, there are 63 per year. And so you multiply that out, and it comes like something like $160 trillion worth of regulations. Yeah, and we see it everywhere. Every time you go to do something in your business and your life, you got to get some approvals. You got to watch out. You got to hire a lawyer. So no wonder the economy has slowed down, and it did. It was fine. The growth rate, GDP growth rate in 1960 was 5%. GDP growth rate now, 0. It's 0. And that's not to say it's going to stay 0, but it's averaging out about 1% over the last 3 years or so. I mean, it's crazy. We've run through this whole, in my lifetime, from being dynamic, forward-looking growth, even those crazy 60s years, the hippies, live for today. They were crazy and they were a lot of fun, but they were very optimistic. We all thought that the world was getting better, and it was just a question of how to make it better. Now, do young people think that now? I don't think so. Now they're worried about their sexual identity or something, or whether they're using the right pronouns, or, how they're going to get to work in an electric car and stuff with no charging station around. I mean, they're all worried about other kinds of things, and they're not optimistic things. They think the world is going to get worse because of pollution, because of too much, it's getting too hot. The news media tells you every year the snowstorm's coming. Oh my goodness, climate change. Heat coming. Oh my goodness, it's hot. Oh my goodness, it's dry. There's drought. Is it really that much worse? I don't know. But in the 1960s, nobody paid any attention to that stuff. We were just went about our business. And now we have to pay attention to everything. I don't know. I'm just, now I'm at the stage in life where I get to look back and I think, wow, what a lucky time to be alive. Everything went just perfectly for me. Will it go perfectly for my children and grandchildren? I wouldn't bet on it. So that's the answer to, are you optimistic? I wouldn't bet on it.
Well, you recently wrote what I would call, like, in the revolutionary times, a pamphlet called "The Day America Dies." What was the thesis there? I'm assuming it is looking forward to a debt crisis, or a period of time when people aren't seeing improvements in their lives in the lucky way that you were able to enjoy your life over the span of 60 through 2020.
Yeah. Well, guess what? This is the first time Americans, at least in my lifetime, first time Americans have ever gone to stores and found that the shelves were not fully stocked. Never before has that happened. We always had plenty. You could say what you want about American society and how silly and dumb it was, but the shelves were always fully stocked, and now they're not. Now there are all kinds of things going on. And I think that's a fundamental change. And now we have prices rising. We have all kinds of things going on. We have so much debt that the Fed almost can't get control. You mentioned earlier the Fed has lost control and can't control. Well, I think that's largely correct. right now the Fed is making sounds, making noises about correcting things, about tightening, but it's not really tightening yet. We're still way below where we need to be to get a control of inflation. So as near as I can tell, this inflation is probably going to get a lot worse before it gets a lot better.
And so what kind of conclusions do you draw in The Day America Dies? It sounds like you're pointing to a specific time period, but really you're talking about an era, an
I'm
epoch.
talking about an era, but I'm talking about a specific time period because I think this energy crisis will hit us sooner rather than later. We're doing lots of things to influence the way people spend their money and what kind of energy they use. But the world as we know it was created by people who were not directed by government bureaucrats about how to find energy, how to use energy. It was a different kind of world. And now that it is being directed by government bureaucrats, I think we can expect the same sort of catastrophe that always happens when government bureaucrats step in a major way to influence decisions that are critical, that's to say agriculture and energy, critical to our lives. And the last time we've seen anything like this was when Chairman Mao in 1960s declared this Cultural Revolution. And he said, among other things, that from now on, we'll plant our seeds closer together so the crop yields will be higher. Well, that didn't happen. The opposite happened, and 50 million people starved. So I don't know what's going to happen. But just this year in Europe, they're expecting very, very bad winter because people don't have gas. They don't have energy. Price of electricity in Europe today, and I'm right there, the price of electricity is priced as though oil were trading at $1,000 a barrel. That's pretty darn expensive. And that prices a lot of people out. So we're looking at, it depends on how bad the winter is, but they could have a very, very bad winter in Europe this year with a lot of people being very annoyed. And where that goes, I don't know. But it wouldn't be the first time in history that it results in a major catastrophe.
Well, another example of that is when Lenin declared that their goal was in the 1920s to take over the commanding heights of the economy, which were like the steel manufacturing plants, the railroads, all of the farms. They collectivize all the farms, and so that the government could direct everything. And then you ended up with people standing in line for bread because they couldn't produce enough wheat. Many people starved. I think it was 5 million people starved.
The example, the further the example, I expect an energy crisis, is what I expect. But energy crises have a way of leaking out into other kind of crises. Our whole economy in the United States runs on diesel fuel. Diesel fuel. Trucks deliver stuff, and trucks run on diesel fuel. Trucks run on diesel fuel to deliver bread, milk, everything else that we eat. If there were a big crisis in diesel fuel, just shortages all of a sudden, we've seen how shortages can happen, then there could be other shortages that sort of compounds, and electricity goes out, you can't pump the diesel fuel. So anyway, I'm just warning people that it's dangerous for government bureaucrats to intercede, to meddle in critical industries like this. They've been handing out money, wasting money, doing stupid wars for a long, long time. But this is the first time they have interfered with the very thing that makes it possible for 8 billion people to live on planet Earth. That thing is energy. And these guys don't know anything about energy except they don't like it. They want it to come from windmills. Well, good luck on that.
Yeah, I just got back from a trip to Greenland, which I will be writing about in the weeks ahead. But we were looking at the melting of the ice sheet in Greenland, and it's melting at a rate that's faster than the 1,000-year cycles that we know we can document now. And that has the alarmists pushing policy through government to reduce carbon emissions, which means they're trying to shut down coal, they're trying to shut down natural gas, they're trying to shut down oil, the use of oil and gasoline. like those are all like the prosperity of American society, the thing that we've come used to, we've come to rely on, all comes at the behest of cheap energy. And that that seems like, just to echo your point, it seems like just by government decree that is going to be, that's being taken away by not necessarily sound reasoning. It's one thing to take it away if you have a replacement, but the replacements haven't been proven yet, nor has the science that shows that it's being caused by CO2 and other things.
Yeah, nor is it clear
complex.
that it's not clear that you could do anything about it, even if it were true that humans have caused the white ice sheets to melt. It's not clear that you could do anything about it,
Right.
or that even if you could do anything about it, it would be worth the cost. The cost could be lives, and there could be people starving to death.
Yeah.
There are a lot. We in the West, in Europe and in America, we're used to having plenty to eat and plenty of fuel. But there are millions and millions, hundreds of millions of people who live very much at the margin, who barely have enough to eat. So imagine you shut down the world economy, just shut it down a little bit. Instead of a 5% growth rate, you have a 1% minus growth rate. How many millions of people fall off? I don't know. And it's not for me to say. It's just that I think our policymakers are not at all aware that they may be making one of the biggest mistakes in all of history.
Yeah, one of the things the leader of our trip, whom I'll be writing about, repeated over and over again, even if we cut out all emissions of both carbon dioxide and methane, the two known greenhouse gases, even if we cut them all out tomorrow, the heat is still baked into the land and also into the oceans, and the ice sheets are going to melt anyway. Like, it's not just entirely a man-made problem. It's a natural cycle, and it's when you get policymakers involved and politics involved that they mess up the economy without any definitive replacement for cheap energy, or thought of what the phrase about politics is the unintended consequences are much worse in many cases than the solutions that are proposed to address them.
Mm-hmm.
That's the tragedy of it all, is that you and I can talk about it, and you can write about it, I can write about it, but they just carry on trying to.
Yeah, we can't do anything about it.
Well, we can take care of ourselves, and that's really what the point is. I'm a believer in stoicism, that there are things that you can take care of and there's things that you can't, and it's better just to focus on the ones that you can.
Yeah.
Anyway, Bill, I will catch up with you once the book comes out. We'll have another conversation about Win, Win or Lose, or whatever title ends up getting published. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And I'm jealous that you're at I.O.U.S.A, because it's a quiet place to spend August.
It is, and come back next year. I'll be here all summer.
Yeah, I'll plan on it.
Yeah, bring the family.
All right, great. Bill, thanks a lot. I'll talk to you later.